You are a woman in the year 1830, standing barefoot on the frozen stones of a Yorkshire market square. The morning air cuts like glass, your breath trailing in white puffs as villagers gather, not with cheer, but with the quiet murmur of something darker. You feel it in your stomach, a sick, heavy churn of dread, tangled with a flicker of impossible hope. Around your neck is a rope, not a necklace, not an ornament. A halter the kind they use for cattle. Your husband grips the other end, with the casual roughness of someone handling livestock. His breath reeks of the ale he downed at sunrise, his voice loud and slurred. What'll you give me for this strong woman? Good teeth, can cook, sew, scrub floors till they shine. Laughter ripples through the crowd, some men nodding, some smirking. A few step forward to inspect you. They prod your hands for calluses, stare at your face like they're appraising a brood mare. You stand there, motionless, heart racing like a trapped animal. In mere minutes, you'll be owned by someone else. And the worst part? This isn't a crime. It's not some drunken madness or back alley scandal. This is legal. This is custom. This is the closest thing to a divorce you'll ever get. One man steps closer, his eyes scanning your face like he's sizing up a prize pig. Another lifts your hand, examining your fingers for scars, proof that you've worked, proof you're worth the price. They murmur to each other. Strong frame, wide hips, decent teeth. One chuckles crudely about what you'd look like in his bed. You stare straight ahead, chest heaving, ears roaring. You're not allowed fear, or anger, or pride. Just silence, because in the next few moments, your entire life will be ripped away or handed back, depending on who wins the bid. Maybe the man who takes you will be gentler. Maybe he'll be worse. Maybe he won't beat you for every burnt crust of bread. Maybe your children won't cry themselves to sleep from hunger. But the true horror? The truth that freezes your blood more than the frost beneath your feet? This spectacle, this public auction of your body and future ... is perfectly legal. No laws are being broken here. In fact, in this cruel, contorted world, it is your only path to freedom, your only road to escape, a rope for a key, a sail for salvation. Before we plunge deeper into these forgotten rituals of pain, survival, and endurance, if uncovering the buried truths of history resonates with you, consider subscribing. These aren't just stories. They are mirrors, showing us how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I find it breathtaking that across continents and centuries, we gather here united by curiosity and perhaps conscience, because what you're about to hear isn't just a tale of cruelty. Wife selling wasn't born from sadism alone, though. There was plenty of that. It grew out of a broken legal machine, one so merciless and blind that the poor were left with no options except the grotesque. To understand why hundreds of men dragged their wives to market squares with halters around their necks, we must enter a world where women were not women at all. They were things, livestock, legal shadows. In Victorian England, the law didn't just fail women, it erased them. Under the brutal doctrine of coverture, a married woman had no legal existence. As Sir William Blackstone, the era's legal authority, put it, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. In other words, she vanished. Her identity was swallowed whole by her husband's. She became a femme covert, a covered woman, hidden behind his legal self, like a ghost under a shroud. Take Mary Thompson. She's fictional, but she's real. The every woman of the 1820s. Before marriage, she could own land, earn wages, sign contracts, and sue in court. But the moment she said, "I do," she disappeared from the law's eyes. Her life was no longer hers. Every penny she earned his. Every gift or inheritance from her parents his. The bread she baked, the laundry she scrubbed, the very dress. On her back all his. And if he raised a fist to her face, if he beat her until she couldn't walk, the law looked away. Because that was his right. A man could discipline his wife like a child. Like a dog, if he drank away the rent, or brought home disease from the brothel, or spent his days gambling while she slaved with bleeding hands, the law said nothing. She was trapped, no protection, no escape, no voice, until something broke. Until Mary couldn't take the bruises, or the hungry children, or the shame. Until she met anyone who offered not love, but simply relief. For the wealthy, divorce existed, but it may as well have lived on the moon. Before 1857, ending a marriage required a personal act of Parliament. It cost £1,000, today's equivalent of over £100,000, a sum no working-class soul could even dream of. Even after the law changed in 1857, the cost of a divorce, around £40, still towered above a laborer's yearly income. For most, it was impossible. So what were the choices for a poor, battered woman? There were 5. Mutually agree to separate, though neither could legally remarry. Vanish, disappear, into the night, and hope never to be found. Beg the church courts for a legal separation. Costly and useless for starting over. Die, or be sold. For some, that last one was the only way out. The idea sounds medieval, barbaric, and it was. But wife selling began sometime in the 1600s, not in some savage wilderness, but in England's market towns, among its working poor. If the law said a woman was property, people reasoned, why not transfer her like any other possession? It became ritual, a crude, humiliating, and strangely structured event. A parody of divorce. A mockery of marriage. First, an ad in the newspaper, cold as stone. John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market on Tuesday next. Healthy, strong, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused. Sometimes it was nastier. Thomas. Brown, tired of his wife, will dispose of her to any man willing to take her. On the appointed day, the woman would be led to the market square like cattle wearing a halter. Around her neck, around her arm, around her waist. Rope if he was poor. Ribbon if he was pretending dignity. The halter marked her as property. A signal. This woman is for sale. And then the performance began. The husband, often drunk, sometimes jeering, would act as auctioneer. What am I bid for this fine woman? 26 years old. Strong hips. Good with a needle. All her teeth. The crowd closed in. Men examined her like a workhorse. Touched her hands, judged her face. Some asked her to speak, to test her refinement. But here's the twist. Here's where history confounds our modern lens. In many cases, the sale had already been arranged. The buyer wasn't a stranger. It was the woman's lover. The auction wasn't violence. It was strategy. A grotesque loophole. A public divorce disguised as degradation. The shame was real. But it served a purpose. It made the transaction public, witnessed, irreversible. In the eyes of the community, if not the courts, this sale was binding. Take Brighton, 1826. A man sold his tidy-looking wife to a sailor for £5. The woman went gladly. The newspaper said it was all done with good humor. Behind that smile? Desperation, courage, strategy. Or Wallock Market, 1830. A woman sold for 2 shillings and 6pence, snapped at her husband when he hesitated. Let be, you rogue. I will be sold. I want to change. Her voice still echoes defiant, unbroken. She wasn't just being sold. She was choosing to escape. Prices varied wildly. Some women fetched £100 plus £25 per child. Others, a pint of ale. Most went for a few shillings. But the money didn't matter. What mattered was the ceremony. The witnesses. The halter. When the deal was done, a rope was handed to the new husband. A grotesque handshake. A contract made of humiliation. In some towns, they even drew up formal deeds. I, John Parsons, in exchange for £6 and 6 shillings, do hereby transfer my wife Anne to John Tucker for the term of her natural life. They sealed it with a drink, sometimes a feast, even church bells, a wedding built on ashes. These weren't just sales. They were public theater. Entire towns would turn out. People brought their children, their lunch, their curiosity. It was a carnival of human misery disguised as community ritual. But not all sales were tidy arrangements between secret lovers. Some were real auctions, raw, chaotic, and terrifying. In 1766, a drunken carpenter in Southwark sold his wife in an alehouse. When he sobered up and begged her to come back, she refused. So he hanged himself. In Manchester, 1824, a wife was sold for 5 shillings. She disliked the buyer, so she was put up again, this time for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. She had a voice, yes, but what kind of choice is that? Which man will hurt me less? Which bed will I cry in? Yorkshire became the beating heart of this dark tradition. Of the 108 known Victorian wife sales, 27 happened there. In Halifax, 1837. A blacksmith named G sold his wife for 1 shilling, then bought her back, then sold her again to a married man for half a crown. When the woman learned what had happened, she stormed in and beat her husband bloody in public. She hadn't agreed. She wasn't merchandise. But that didn't stop the show. In December 1849, in Goole, a man named Ashton discovered his wife had run off with another man while he was in hospital. So he dragged them both to the market. The woman was auctioned publicly, proudly to her lover. The crowd roared with delight. She snapped her fingers at her ex-husband. There, good for. Not. That's more than you'd fetch. Children weren't spared either. Sometimes wives were sold with their children priced like bundles of hay. In 1865, a woman and her 2 children went for £100 plus £25 per child. That's years of wages for a laborer. But it wasn't just desperation that shocked. It was the indifference of the law. Wife selling had no legal foundation. It was, on paper, a farce and act of adultery followed by bigamy. But many local authorities didn't stop it. Some didn't know how. Others didn't want to. In 1819, a magistrate tried to halt a sale in Ashbourne. The crowd pelted him with stones. Later he admitted, "I do not think I have the right to prevent it. It rests upon a custom preserved by the people." Let that sink in. The people preserved it, like folklore, like a sacred tradition. Some officials even encouraged wife sales. Workhouse commissioners eager to avoid the cost of supporting abandoned women pressured husbands to sell instead. In 1814, Henry Cook was forced by authorities to sell his wife. She and her child were led to Cudden Market and sold for 1 shilling. The parish paid for the travel and even threw a wedding feast afterward. And always the market square. Always the livestock stalls. These weren't just convenient places. They were statements. Declarations. Just as animals changed hands on those cobbled stones, so too did women. No paperwork. No lawyers. Just rope, ale, and shame. The symbolism was brutal. The halter wasn't metaphor, it was truth. A woman wasn't. Like livestock, she was livestock. Some sales even weighed the woman before selling her priced by the pound. That wasn't a sick joke. That was legal logic in action. By the 1840s, things began to change. Slowly, social attitudes shifted. Newspapers started calling the practice disgraceful. The rising middle class, eager to feel civilized, pushed for prosecution. Religious groups like the Salvation Army preached against it, but even they couldn't escape the grip of reality. In 1889, one of their own ironically sold his wife in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, for a shilling, because preaching is easy. Escaping poverty is not. A final recorded wife sale happened in 1913. A woman, standing in a Leeds police court, claimed she had been sold to her husband's workmate for £1. By then, wife selling was a dying custom. But the rot behind it hadn't gone anywhere, because here's the real horror. Wife selling wasn't just a scandal. It was a symptom, a crack in the surface of a deeper sickness. These weren't monsters or savages. They were desperate people trying to survive inside a system that offered no exit. When the law locks all doors, people break windows. These women standing in mud with ropes around their throats were not just victims of cruel husbands. They were victims of a legal system that refused to admit they were human. They were erased from the law. And yet, they fought to survive, fought to escape, fought for dignity in a world that gave them none. Some endured this ritual because it offered what courts and churches refused a chance. A second life, and the crowds? They weren't just voyeurs. They were witnesses. A market sale was theater, yes, but it was also rough justice. A courtroom without robes. A divorce without permission. In 1860, in a Yorkshire village, a young wife was sold for 18 pence. The buyer hesitated. The villagers responded by burning him and his new bride in effigy. Even in places where wife selling was common, it left scars. It wasn't simple. It was never simple. Even the elite weren't untouched. The Duke of Chandos, an aristocrat, reportedly bought his second wife for half a crown from a violent innkeeper. He married her, educated her. She later gave a deathbed speech, telling her servants her story, and urging them to trust Providence. Was it love, redemption, or just a softer chain? Wife selling was cruel, but it was also a form of rebellion, a twisted bid for freedom. Many women insisted on being sold. Some arranged it themselves. Some paid agents to buy them out. They weren't powerless. They were survivors, navigating a system designed to crush them with the only tools they had: humiliation, spectacle, and hope. This practice didn't survive for 2 centuries because men were heartless. It survived because society offered no alternatives. Imagine a world where you make 10 shillings a week, where you live with your whole family in one room. No plumbing, no heat. Your children, 6 years old, working 12-hour shifts in a cotton mill. And your husband, violent, drunk, or just indifferent, has full control over your body, your money, your life. When that contract breaks down, when marriage becomes prison, the law offers silence. Only the market offers a way out. Newspapers called these people animals. But between the lines, you see something else. Dignity, desperation, defiance. To us, it's unthinkable. A woman sold like a cow, a halter around her neck, an audience bidding, and it was horrific, but it was also a rebellion in plain sight. A community trying to patch a hole the law refused to mend. A ceremony forged in suffering, not savagery. The practice died not from outrage, but because the law finally began to shift. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 began to chip away at coverture. For the first time, a married woman could own her wages, could inherit, could exist. But for the women in the market squares, it was too late. They stood beneath church towers, on auction blocks, surrounded by laughter and leers, and hoped. Because the world they lived in didn't see them as people. It saw them as property, disposable, transferable, erasable. And in the face of that, they dared to survive, to barter for freedom, to grab the rope tied around their neck, and turn it into a lifeline. They paid for it with shame, with stares, with stories that history tried to bury, but now we remember. Wife selling reminds us that rights are not gifts, they are battles won, that law is not always justice, and that progress is not inevitable. These women, anonymous and voiceless, left behind a legacy not of defeat, but of fierce, desperate courage. They were sold, but they were never truly owned. They remind us that when systems fail to provide justice, people will invent their own. However imperfect, however morally fraught, those makeshift solutions arise from necessity, not cruelty. As you sit in your modern world, where divorce is a legal right, where you can own property, vote, and be recognized as a full person under the law, remember the women who bought their freedom for a few shillings. Remember the price of their dignity paid in open-air markets. Under the gaze of jeering crowds, they wore halters, not because they were animals, but because that was the only language the law understood. The last auctions faded more than a century ago, but the legacy remains, lingering like a bad smell in the archives of history. These sales raise unsettling questions about the systems we've built and who those systems fail. They force us to look beyond the spectacle and into the eyes of real women daughters, mothers, sisters who stood in those markets not as victims of whim, but as survivors navigating a rigged game with what little agency they had. Even now, long after the rope has been untied and the crowds have gone home, their stories ask us the questions we're still struggling to answer. How do we build systems that serve the vulnerable, not just the powerful? How do we prevent the law from becoming a cage for those it's meant to protect? Because if we fail to ask and answer those questions, we may yet find ourselves back in the square, watching desperate people gamble with their dignity in hopes of a better life. The halters may be gone, but the choices, the desperation, the fragile hope, they remain. And so does the obligation to do better.